The origins of this phrase must lie in the works of Nestorius of Constantinople. 3 of his works, his Apology and his sermons 9 and 27, contain almost identical language. Sermon 9 bears the closest similarities to the quotation in Jacob's homily. Nestorius delivered this sermon, sermon number 9, at Christmas time in 428, perhaps in response to the debate over whether Mary was the God-bearer or Theotokos. Within this homily, Nestorius states, and this is quotation 3 on the handouts, "O dear friend, Mary did not give birth to the divinity." This homily of Nestorius, sermon number 9, became an important reference point in the Christological controversies of the 5th and 6th centuries. It circulated widely and was included as part of the acts of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th ecumenical councils. Nestorius' homily first put into circulation the phrase, "Mary did not give birth to the divinity." But his opponents quickly seized on this language in their polemic against him and spread it yet further. Around spring 430, just over a year after Nestorius delivered his sermon, Cyril of Alexandria would cite Nestorius' language in his polemical work, The 5 Tomes Against Nestorius. After this point, it seems to have become a trope against Nestorius, as evidenced already in the work of Eusebius of Dorylaeum, writing in the mid-5th century. He references this quotation in his work, The Protest Against Nestorius, to make a comparison between Paul of Samosata, seen as an arch-heretic of types, and Nestorius. Eusebius of Dorylaeum writes, in quotation 4 on your handouts, "Paul of Samosata said, 'Mary did not bear the word.' In concert, Nestorius said, 'O dear friend, Mary did not give birth to the divinity.'" Jacob of Sarug's homily on the faith uses this phrase in a similar fashion. Thus, Jacob's criticism of the insolent one in his homily on the faith reflects other anti-Diophysite writings. He criticizes his Diophysite opponents, whether they are Chalcedonian or Church of the East. In polemic, there isn't much of a distinction made, by attributing the language of Nestorius to them. Chalcedonian thinkers, of course, routinely condemn Nestorius' thought, and only a couple traces of the commemoration of Nestorius in the Church of the East survive from the 5th and 6th centuries. But Jacob and his fellow Miaphysites associate Nestorius' name with their Diophysite Christology in their polemic. This first passage allows us to see one aspect of how Jacob of Sarug wove specific polemical remarks into his homilies. The language of insolence, as I've already mentioned, appears frequently throughout this homily, and importantly at the very beginning. Jacob portrays insolence as a generic vice throughout the homily. His use of this term in this passage just strengthens the polemic against Diophysite Christology. His audience has already learned that insolence is a vice. Now they will associate this vice with the person who adheres to the Christology attributed to Jacob's anonymous, insolent interlocutor. Let us now consider a second quotation of the homily on the faith that reveals how Jacob adjusts his polemical meter to fit his polemical language to fit his poetic meter. In part 3b of the homily, this is in the exhortative part of the homily where he's encouraging his audience to adhere to the Christology that he's already outlined. Jacob contrasts a false confession of faith from the true faith. In this section, he preaches, and this is quotation 5 on page 3, or the backside of the second handout. Jacob preached, "Far be it from you, my brother, that you would worship a human with God, or another when he was not born from God. Others have deceived you, scribes with wise words, so that you attribute the cross to a human and not to God. As for you, our companion, attribute the whole cross to God, for you are only worshiping him because he is God." The first line in this quotation contains the phrase, "worship a human." This, too, had become part of a standard array of anti-Diophysite polemic by the 6th century. An analysis of this passage will allow us not only to see Jacob's use of the standard trope, but also the way that he transforms it to fit his poetic meter and preaching context. The phrase worship of a human dates to the 4th century. Athanasius of Alexandria's second oration against the Arians provides the first extant evidence. Athanasius writes in quotation 6 on your handouts, Thus, since we people did not wish to recognize God through his word and to serve the word of God as our natural ruler, God consented to show his own lordship and draw all to himself in a human. It would be unseemly to do this through a mere human, lest holding a human as the Lord, we become worshippers of a human. This quotation should, of course, be understood in the context of the post-Nicene debates. Were Athanasius' opponents correct, on his view, all Christians would worship a mere human and not God. This phrase, worship of a human, subsequently found wider usage in the 4th century in the debate over Apollinarianism. But more importantly for our purposes, this phrase became a source of debate in the Christological controversies of the 5th century. 2 of Nestorius' sermons address this language directly. His use of this phrase, in his sermon number 8, echoes the language of Athanasius. He discusses here, this will be quotation 7 on your handout, a verse from Romans in which Paul seems to indicate both the humanity and the divinity of Christ in close succession. Paul states that Christ was from the Jews according to the flesh, but is also God who is over all. Interpreting this passage, Nestorius preaches, and here the quotation begins, "Listen to Paul proclaim both. He says, from the Jews according to the flesh is Christ, who being God over all is blessed forever. What then, is Christ a mere human, O blessed Paul? No, indeed. While Christ is human in the flesh, he is God over all in the divinity. Paul confesses the humanity first, and then speaks about God in reference to the divine conjunction in the open, in order that no one will suspect that Christianity worships a human." The coordination of the phrases mere human and worshiping of a human in this quotation recalls Athanasius. It seems this is what Nestorius has in mind. Cyril of Alexandria again quickly responded to this accusation in a number of works, including his 5 tomes against Nestorius, his second letter to Nestorius, and the famous 12 anathemas or chapters which were appended to his 3rd letter to Nestorius. But Cyril turned this phrase on its head. He rejected Nestorius' idea of the divine conjunction and called Nestorius himself a worshiper of a human, the phrase against which, or the attribution against which Nestorius had been defending himself. Several of Cyril's works that preserved this language then saw translation into Syriac in the 5th century. So we see the spread of this phrase already in the 5th century. Cyril initiated a process through which Nestorius would become known as a worshiper of a human. 6th century works demonstrate that the phrase worshiping a human had become strongly associated with Nestorius. Various genres spread knowledge of this phrase. The emperors Anastasius in the early 6th century and Justinian received letters that accused Nestorius of worshiping a human. Justinian would then incorporate this language into his own works. Syriac authors likewise picked up on this phrase, as the author of the Life of Severus of Antioch shows. The anonymous author of this work praises Severus for defeating Nestorius' worship of a human through his preaching. By the 6th century, the phrase worshiping a human had become strongly connected to Nestorius. Instances of this phrase, of course, including Jacob of Serug's homilies, should be seen within the context of its growing association with Nestorius and those who were linked in their Christology. The poetic nature and preaching context of Jacob's homilies changed the way that he expressed this theology and criticized his opponents. Constraints associated with the meter of poetry, for Jacob, couplets with 12 syllables per line, divided into 3 4-syllable feet, did not allow for word-for-word quotations from prose works. Likewise, the oracular qualities of preaching encourage different ways of presenting the same information. On the one hand, Jacob uses this phrase, worshippers of a human, as an epithet in one of his prose letters. You can find the Syriac of this in the outline to your handout. He wrote this letter, this is letter 32 in his corpus, in the first year of Justin I's reign in 518 to 519, after Justin had sent an army to force the Miaphysite bishop of Edessa to sign a Chalcedonian confession. In the homily on the faith, Jacob does not use this phrase simply as an epithet, but rather makes 2 changes. First, he changes worship to a verb. He writes, "You would worship a human, lenasha teskod." The switch from a nominal to a verbal phrase reflects the imaginary dialogue he holds with his Christian interlocutor. The rhetorical setting of an imagined conversation, often used in Syriac poetry and especially in Syriac preaching, recommends this change. Second, the epithet, as it stands in Jacob's letters, contains 5 syllables, sagdai levarnasha. In this homily, he has to modify human from 3 syllables, levarnasha, to 2 syllables, lenasha, to accommodate each of the 4-syllable feet in which this occurs. The meter and the rhetorical context of the homilies are relevant factors when identifying verbal echoes between Jacob's homilies and the post-Chalcedonian Christological debates. The epithet worshippers of a human became a polemical trope during the 4th through the 6th centuries. Jacob used this phrase in one of his letters, directed against those who participated in an imperialist-sponsored attack on the Miaphysite bishop of Edessa in the year 518. Jacob similarly uses this phrase to describe the false views of his opponents in the homily on the faith. Not only does Jacob have Diophysites as his opponents in both corpora, but he also draws on a similar polemical vocabulary to criticize them. This quotation demonstrates how Jacob artfully adjusts his language to accommodate the poetic meter and the oral context of his preaching. Jacob of Sarug's homily on the faith represents both an atypical and typical work from his corpus. The doctrinal content of the homily would have made it appropriate for various catechetical contexts, and its circulation in manuscripts suggests that it was valued precisely for this doctrinal content. There are not a large number of doctrinal homilies within Jacob's corpus, perhaps 15 or 20 of them in total, out of 400 or so. Yet Jacob's polemical remarks are not unique to this homily. The quotation from the homily on Thomas and New Sunday, with which we began, quotation 1, represents what is a common feature in Jacob's exegetical homilies. Here he criticizes an opponent who is not willing to acknowledge that Thomas's confession was addressed to Jesus as Lord and God. After the analysis of the homily on the faith, it should come as no surprise that the exegesis against which Jacob polemicizes in that quotation can be identified. This is an exegetical trend that is firmly tied to the works of Theodore of Mopsuestia and Nestorius of Constantinople, and doesn't have much of an afterlife in the Church of the East either. In this conclusion, I'd like to reflect briefly on the broader issue of the seeming paradox of Jacob's invective against his opponents, yet his reticence to name them. The 2 case studies on Jacob's polemical language on the homily on the faith have allowed us to see Jacob as a preacher engaged in the debates of his time. He draws on the common tropes of polemical vocabulary aimed here at Diophysite Christology, whether Chalcedonian or Church of the East. He attributes these quotes to an unnamed opponent and rails against these viewpoints. So why not name these opponents? Why not attribute this language to Nestorius? Perhaps one answer to this question is found in the effects of making an opponent anonymous. Jacob's criticisms do not just apply to authors long since dead. Jacob makes his remarks generic, and they now apply to everyone who may think as they do. In this way, his invective cuts deeper. The homily on the faith shows how Jacob of Sarug draws on the polemical tropes directed against specific opponents, but transforms this language so that it meets the homiletical context and poetic demands of his metrical sermons. This presentation has offered a different image of Jacob of Sarug, the one to which we may be accustomed. Jacob's reticence in his homilies to name his opponents sets him aside indeed from his contemporaries. Yet the controversies of his time are buried within his works, even when we must dig deep to extract them. Thank you for your attention.